As she stood accused of committing one of the most heinous murders, the crowd was waiting for her every appearance with bouquets of flowers in their hands ready to throw at her, cheering her on, blow her kisses, admired her elegant gowns as she walked by, almost parading within the crowd. She enjoyed every moment of it. All in the while, she already admitted her guilt. Well, to some extent. The trial of Gabrielle Bompard caused a sensation in Paris in the month of December of 1890. It was the first case in which hypnosis was used as a defense for murder, with the main question of the trial: was she a victim, a pawn in the hands of her lover, or was she a cold, calculating killer? Those who knew Gabrielle described her as a habitual liar, a confused and reckless person with no inhibitions in her actions and life, skills she proved to own from a very young age. Gabrielle was born in Lille in northern France on August 13, 1868. Her father, a wealthy, respected metal dealer, became a widower when Gabrielle was only 9 years old, when her mother died from lung disease. Her father found new love, but Gabrielle and his new lover did not get along, most likely due to Gabrielle's disobedience. In despair, her father forced her to attend boarding schools and convents in the hopes that she would correct her behavior, but she repeatedly misbehaved there as well and ultimately expelled from all the institutions she attended. As a last resort, her father locked her up in a corrective institute where she remained there until the age of 20. Once she was freed, she decided to escape her strict and perhaps intolerant family to seek a new life in Paris. As the months were passing by, and with almost no money in her pockets, she ultimately sought protection from 46-year-old Michel Eyraud. She later on claimed that their paths crossed when she was seeking work as a cashier. Michel, on the other hand, insisted that they met when she solicited him in the street where she was working as a prostitute. Either way, and despite the 26-year age gap, she became his mistress, and together they rented a flat in Paris. Michel never stood with a good reputation in life. Before abandoning his army duties, he was an abusive husband, one who refused to earn his living by working, and one who eventually resorted becoming a known conman. At the time he met Gabrielle, Michel was involved in fraudulent business activities and was soon to be accused of fraud, unless he found enough money to sort out his unlawful affairs. And that is where it all began. To get him out of his unlawful trouble, together they came up with a deadly idea: to lure a wealthy man with Gabrielle's charm, take him back to an apartment and kill him so they can steal all of his money. And together in vanity they devised their plan. The first step on their list was to purchase a trunk large enough to accommodate a human body. For that they traveled all the way to London to purchase the trunk in their efforts to eliminate any tracing back to them. Next on the list was to buy an oilskin fabric to sew a human body back with it. They also purchased rope, a pulley, and a silk cord to use it as a noose. To execute the crime, they rented another apartment in Paris, where they installed the pulley on a crossbeam on the roof and fitted a large curtain across to hide their whole apparatus. All they needed now was to find a victim who would have two main characteristics: a man who carried a large sum of money with him at night, but also a man inclined to easily fall into a woman's charms. Toussaint Augustin Gouffé was a 49-year-old widower raising his 3 daughters in Paris. He was a very successful and well-established bailiff, but he was also a renowned womanizer. Gouffé always had the habit to carry a considerably large sum of money with him at the end of each workday from his office to his house, except on Fridays, where he spent his nights away from home and into a woman's company until the next day, leaving his money hidden in the office, a detail that was not known to most. Gouffé was chosen as the perfect victim by his killers just the night before the murder took place on Thursday, the 25th of July. Michel already knew Gouffé and his weakness to women, But on that particular day, he also found out from his friends about Gouffé's fortune and his daily habit to carry considerably large amounts of money to take home with him. As soon as he received this news, him and Gabrielle realized he was the perfect target and realized that they had to act quickly. When Friday the 26th of July came, Gabrielle started to put their plan into action. She pretended to accidentally bump into Gouffé, where she tried to entice him, and once she realized he was willing to spend the night with her, she invited him at the newly rented apartment for a supposed romantic evening. Gouffé pleasantly accepted. But when he failed to show up at his home the next morning, his family grew increasingly worried, and his housekeeper alerted his brother-in-law, who in turn reported him missing. On the night of the murder, at around 9 p.m., the concierge in Gouffé's office heard a strange noise and then someone going upstairs. He initially brushed it off as being Gouffé himself, but then realized that it was in fact a stranger, but by the time he hurried to confront him, the stranger left without giving the concierge time to see his face. When the office was examined the next day, all money was found intact and accounted for. The safe was not tampered with, and all in all, nothing stood out as unusual to anyone, except Gouffé's unexplained and mysterious disappearance. As Gabrielle lured Gouffé into her apartment and into her arms, she playfully placed the silk cord around the victim's neck and said to him, "What a nice necktie it makes." But that sentence was Michel's cue, who was hiding behind the curtain. As soon as he heard the signal, he pulled the rope from the pulley with such force with the intention to strangle Gouffé. But things didn't go as planned. Gouffé's weight gave in and the whole device crashed to the ground. Michel then quickly emerged from behind the curtain and resorted to manually strangle his victim. It took 2 minutes. At that point, and to their disappointment, they realized that Gouffé did not have the money he was supposed to have with him. Michel then searched the dead man's pockets, where he obtained his hidden watch and ring and a set of keys. Holding the keys, he hurried to Gouffé's office, where he was frantically searching for any money. His efforts proved fruitless. It seemed that in his rash and quivering haste, Michel missed the sum of 14,000 francs that was lying behind some papers. Feeling baffled and despaired, he returned to his mistress and the corpse. It was now very obvious to them that the crime had been a ghostly failure. They then undressed and placed the body in the bag they previously prepared and laid it to the trunk, which was guarded by Gabrielle overnight. The next morning, they transported the trunk and boarded it on a train traveling from Paris to Lyon, and then carried it to its final destination in the suburbs of Lyon, where they attempted to throw it down an embankment, hoping that the body would fall into the river. But to their bad luck, the body landed on a bush. Michel broke the trunk into pieces and disposed of it nearby. The pair then resorted to their final piece of their plan. They fled the country. First they went to Dovertown in England, where they posed as Monsieur Labourteur, supposedly traveling with his son. You see, Gabrielle was a very petite woman with a young-looking face, so when she chopped off her hair, she easily disguised herself as a young boy. From there, they traveled to Canada, now presenting themselves as a wealthy businessman accompanied by his daughter. And from there, they finally settled to San Francisco. During their trip, they met Georges Garanger, a wealthy Frenchman who almost immediately fell under Gabrielle's spell. That made Michel very excited, as they were on the look for their next victim to rob and kill. Their initial strategy was for Georges and Gabrielle to travel together and meet Michel in New York so they can kill him there. But there was one issue that Michel overlooked. Gabrielle was fed up with him, and when she fell in love with Georges, she decided to escape with him and away from Michel's dreadful character. Gabrielle eventually confessed everything to her new love. With Georges by her side, she devised a new plan in her head. Together they traveled to Paris and straight to the police station. For several days, the residents of the Millery district, a suburb near Lyon, had been complaining about a very unpleasant smell in the summer of 1889. The hot days of that August made it even worse, to the point that forced a road worker to investigate. As he was walking around the bushes to identify the smell's origins, he came across a large oilskin cloth bag situated behind a bush. "I think it's a human corpse," he told the authorities. He was right. A few days later, the broken pieces of a trunk were discovered near the site where the worker found the body, and since it had the same rotting smell of death, the police believed that the trunk was connected with the corpse in the sack, so the pieces were kept as evidence. The preliminary autopsy on the corpse estimated that the person was dead for at least 2 to 5 weeks, and that it belonged to a man of approximate age of 35 to 40 years old. But the stage of decomposition was so advanced that made the identification of the body almost impossible. On a hunch, Marie-Françoise Goron, the lead Parisian detective, assumed a possible connection between the missing case of Gouffé and the body, so he sent Gouffé's brother-in-law to Lyon for identification. But the relative also failed to positively identify him, and with that the coroner was left to rely on the body's dark hair color, which also failed to associate the body as Gouffé, who had red hair. The body was then buried and identified, but the coroner decided to keep a log of the deceased hair. Detective Goron was not convinced with the coroner's conclusion, so after he personally examined the lock of hair, he placed it in distilled water, which washed off all the dirt, slowly revealing a reddish color. This strengthened the detective's belief that the body was in fact Gouffé, so he turned to seek the expertise of Dr. Alexandre Lagazagne, one of the founders of criminal anthropology specializing in using skeletal analysis to identify body remains. The body was exhumed 4 months later, where Dr. Lagazagne performed an advanced post-mortem examination. He measured the long bones to estimate the height. He approximated the correct age, which he determined to be around 50 years old, based on the wear and tear of the teeth. He discovered that one of the molars was missing, and a deformity in the body's right knee and ankle, indicating that the person was walking with a limp. Gouffé's relatives verified that Gouffé had a limp, and Gouffé's military and dental records corroborated Lagazagne's findings and Goron's initial suspicion that the body was indeed the missing man. A broken thyroid cartilage revealed the cause of death to be by strangulation, with the manner of death being homicide. The pieces of the trunk held another clue. There was a train company label that marked its destination from Paris to Lyon and also bear the date on it. 27th July 188, with the last digit of the year missing. Even so, the detective was certain that the date on the label associated with the day after Gouffé was last seen alive, 26 July 1889. He also ordered for the trunk to be reconstructed and exposed it within the morgue in Paris, where thousands of visitors were able to view it. That, along with the massive press coverage of the details of the events and a reward offered, gained a number of witnesses who came forward with any detail that they could recall. And that eventually led to 2 very important leads: that the trunk had originated from London, bought and brought to Paris by a woman named Gabrielle, and both her and Michel's notable absence since the victim's disappearance in July. A massive hunt began to locate the missing pair, who then became one of the world's most wanted criminals. Once in Paris, Gabrielle willingly walked into the police station, where she casually and half-smiling introduced herself as Gabrielle Bompard, even though she knew she was wanted, and then began to convey her versions of the story on Gouffé's murder. The first version of her narrative encircled around her being Michel's victim, claiming she was just a submissive mistress who only found out about the murder and its details based on what Michel told her on their way to the United States, and that she was definitely not involved in it. But based on the evidence the police had, they did not buy into her story, and she was arrested shortly after her questioning. She then decided to declare that she was in fact hypnotized by Michel, and then she supposedly became his pawn before, during, and after the murder, and further claimed that he was in fact the one who instructed her to become Michel's accomplice to cause Gouffé's death. Her plea entailed that all of her actions, including purchasing of the murder accessories as well as placing the silk cord on Gouffé's neck, derived under Michel's influence. Following a large manhunt, Michel was finally apprehended 6 months later in Havana in Cuba and brought back to Paris. Now that the two criminals were finally locked, their trial began, which soon gained its reputation as the first trial where hypnotism was the debate between the defense and the prosecution. At the end of the 19th century, hypnosis was a hot subject for endless discussions and was regarded as highly possible by respected scientists. Prior and during the trial, Gabrielle met with fame. The press and the people were obsessed with her peculiar character, her petite frame, an innocent-looking face, her every move to and from the courthouse, every meal she had, and even every outfit she wore for each day of the trial. All about her was deemed worthy of public interest, and she played along with it, doing her best to charm the crowd. The public's unusual obsession assumes to originate from her plea of extenuating circumstances, representing herself as a mere instrument under hypnosis at the hands of Michel. She was later dubbed as one of the first celebrity criminals, with some comparing the crowd's bizarre fascination towards her to the one expressed during the O.J. Simpson's trial. A further disgrace in connection with the trial was that the judge allowed the public to purchase tickets to watch the trial, and of course the courtroom was packed with spectators glued to their seats, witnessing as all the drama was unfolding. Their trial took place before the Paris court on December 16th of 1890. Hypnosis experts from both sides were brought in, each to their own argument, supporting or opposing the possibility of a murder committed by Gabrielle whilst she was hypnotized. Gabrielle was deemed to be susceptible to hypnotism, where at a young age her father ordered for her to undergo hypnosis in the hopes for her to reform with her misconduct and promiscuous character. There were witnesses brought in by the defense, including her doctor, who testified to her ability to fall into a deep sleep during hypnotic seances, dating as far back when she was a young child. 3 doctors were appointed by the examining magistrate to report on her mental state. They all concluded unanimously Gabrielle was susceptible to hypnosis, but there was no ground for rationale that she had been acting under such influence when she participated in the murder. In fact, the medical's collective opinion find her to be alert, clever, and a sane person, but morally blind. Even though her defense wanted to attempt to hypnotize Gabrielle during the trial so they can prove their point, the judge did not allow it. Michel knew his fate before the trial even began, but he still refused to assume full responsibility for Gouffé's murder. According to him, he never hypnotized Gabrielle, but he himself was under her spell of charm, obeying instructions and demands from her and acting under her irresistible influence. He also insisted that she was the main executor of the actual killing. Michel was sentenced to death, with his execution taking place on February 3rd of 1891. Gabrielle, on the other hand, was shockingly only sentenced to 20 years of hard labor, despite her obvious direct involvement in the killing. Even more outrageously, she was freed only after 12 years. We will never fully understand how the jury accepted her mitigating factors and showed leniency, but either way, her short-lived fame was just as forgotten in people's minds as she was when she died in the early 1920s. Until next time.